Hi, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about intellectual virtues. This is an aspect of critical thinking that is often overlooked, but is getting more attention these days. And so to get started, I'd like to share my screen with you. And this handout is partly based on the following readings, and down below, I will provide you a link to these websites so you can look at them yourself. But let me start with some questions. Number one, what habits do you have to cultivate to become a professional athlete? Maybe you have an athletic background, maybe you don't, but you know that if you want to be good at a sport, you've got to work hard, right? And that involves cultivating certain habits. So what kind of habits might those be? How about exercise? How about a healthy diet? How about a specific type of training, right? So these are the habits that you're going to need to cultivate if you want to become a professional athlete. Consider the next question. Think of other kinds of careers. Are there habits necessary to each one? So think about a job that you want in the future or your dream job. What type of habits do you need to cultivate now in order to attain that? Consider people who are already in that line of work. What type of habits did they cultivate? Maybe they had to study for a long time. Studying is a habit. Maybe they had to practice self-denial. Other things they wanted in life, they had to give up in order to pursue this dream. Maybe it's endurance, maybe it's persistence. So these things are habits that you might need to cultivate in order to attain your dream job. Finally, think about life in general. Are there habits necessary to live a good life? Think about people you would describe as good. What habits are characteristic of their lives? Your answers to the last question would be called moral virtues. And Aristotle, the father of logic, is the most famous person to talk about these virtues. And what he had to say about them can be found in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics. So at this point, I'm going to talk about moral virtues a bit more, and then we're going to get to intellectual virtues in a bit. For Aristotle, moral virtues are character traits needed to live well. They are means between two extremes called vices. And if we can identify the opposite vices, we can locate a virtue in the middle. So on the one hand, there's the vice of excess, and on the other, there's the vice of deficit. For example, if we know that cowardice is a vice, it's going to be one of deficit. And so is recklessness, which is going to be on the other side, excess. Then we can identify the virtue in the middle, and we'll call that courage. And so I've got this chart here to illustrate that. And Aristotle talks about a number of these virtues, and the list of virtues can be actually quite long. We can spend a lot of time listing these off, although we won't. And the point is that you can identify these virtues and vices if you have part of the information in the chart. So we've already done the work for courage here. Let's look at generosity. So we're given generosity as a golden mean, as the virtue. So what is the deficit? If you lack generosity, what do we say of you? You're stingy, right? So the vice of deficit in this case would be stinginess. And on the other side, can you be too generous? Can you be too generous with others? I think the answer to that's yes. But what's the word that identifies that vice when you're too generous with others? And I don't know, maybe it's extravagance, maybe it's something else. Sometimes we don't have a single word that identifies the vice in any particular case, or even the virtue sometimes. And sometimes we just have to offer a description. But the fact that we can agree that there is a situation or a vice there is all that we really need. So in generosity, maybe it's extravagance. Now look at honesty here. This would be a good example of what I just said. So if you lack honesty, we have a word for that, right? That's, well, dishonest, or you're a liar. And on the other side, can you be too honest? I think we would describe somebody like that as being brutally honest or blunt, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and move forward here. Moral virtues aren't just about doing the right thing, but also about having the right emotions. As Aristotle says, emotions should be felt, quote, at the right times, with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way. And this is characteristic of virtue. So again, moral virtues aren't just about doing the right thing, but it's doing it in the right way, and it's being a certain way, it's feeling a certain way. So it's a very holistic picture of what it means to live the good life or do the right thing. So next, if you find yourself lacking in courage, generosity, or compassion, don't fret. Aristotle describes how to fix this by practicing. He says, men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. In other words, we can learn to develop the right habits. And here in the handout, I say a few things about virtue ethics, but I'm going to go ahead and skip down to what we're talking about today, and that is intellectual virtues. If there are moral virtues like these, do you think there are also intellectual virtues? Are there habits of good thinking? First, you need to consider this question: what is the goal of studying or intellectual inquiry? Isn't it knowledge? Isn't it truth? And so the next question is, are there certain habits or traits that are more likely to help you realize this goal? What are they? And so if there are these habits, then we'll call them intellectual virtues, and we can define intellectual virtues this way: deep personal qualities or character strengths required for good thinking and learning. And the Intellectual Virtues Academy, which is one of the websites I've linked below and above in the handout, gives us this list and divides it into these three dimensions. The first one are the virtues of getting started. So as you're starting your intellectual journey, your intellectual inquiry, what sort of virtues do you need to cultivate? And they say there are three: curiosity, intellectual humility, and intellectual autonomy. And so if you're not curious, you're not going to even start the journey, right? I mean, you may be forced to because you're taking a class in the subject, but that's not really part of the life of virtue, the virtue of the mind, right? You want to be curious. You want to be interested in the subject. You want to be humble. A person who's humble is more likely to acquire knowledge in an area because they're not proud. They don't think they already have the information. Because if you're proud and you're arrogant about something and the truth passes in front of you, you're going to miss it, right? Because you're going to think you already have it, even though you don't. Next, the second area that they described is executing well, which means that once you start the process of acquiring knowledge, then what sort of virtues come into play here? And they list three: attentiveness, carefulness, and thoroughness. So you can imagine a researcher who doesn't have these virtues, what type of research are they going to produce? How much should we doubt the conclusions they arrive at if they're not careful in their research, if they're not thorough in their research? You see, this would undermine your research agenda, your research project. Number three, handling challenges. So the challenges that might crop up in the course of your research or your intellectual inquiry. Three virtues here: open-mindedness, intellectual courage, and tenacity. So if you don't have these, then you're going to also run into trouble as well. If you're closed-minded, say you're not open to other points of view, then if the other point of view happens to be true and yours false, you're not going to see it. So you need to cultivate that kind of virtue, open-mindedness. I'll go ahead and skip down to the next section. From the book Introducing Logic and Critical Thinking Skills, I pull a few cases here, and I want to discuss two of them. And so what I want to do is illustrate some of the virtues above in these particular cases. So in the first one, it says, the professor has tried to explain a new theory and appears ready to move on to another topic. Susan can't seem to make sense of the new theory. There's a question she has about the theory that she just can't see how to answer. But she worries that if she asks, others will become irritated with her for slowing up the class, so she keeps quiet. So which of the virtues above are relevant to Susan's case here? And I would suggest curiosity is relevant, courage is relevant, and tenacity, right? Susan needs to have these virtues, or at least needs to cultivate them in her life in order to be successful in this class. The next case is the one about Eleanor, and Eleanor has recently learned that people of her demographic have a tendency to disregard out of hand the views of people in another demographic. Eleanor doesn't want this tendency to distort her own inquiries, So she strives to identify a way whereby she can ensure that she doesn't treat the views of people in this demographic any differently than she treats the views of people in other demographics, including her own. And so what virtues above are relevant in Eleanor's case? I would suggest carefulness, thoroughness, open-mindedness, and courage. I think those are all relevant to Eleanor if she wants to be successful in her project there. Okay, skip down to the last page. And I want to consider for a moment the slogan, think for yourself. This slogan is particularly relevant in my critical thinking classes and my logic classes. And I mean, it drives that topic, right? It drives that subject. We want to form careful thinkers who think for themselves. And this slogan is connected to the virtue above that we saw called intellectual autonomy. So you should be able to think for yourself. You should learn the skills to think for yourself and be the type of person who can think for yourself. But I want to ask you, kind of challenge you to think about this. Can you think for yourself too much? Now, perhaps it's the case that most people in the world don't think for themselves enough, but I want to think about the other side. Can you think for yourself too much? And should we learn to rely more on others? Maybe we don't, maybe in our particular case, we don't rely on others enough. Let me have you consider this question. How much of what you know did you learn by yourself with no help from others whatsoever? And if you consider that, at least I've considered the question, I mean, so much of what I think I know, I've actually learned not from my own research, my own study, my own going out and experiencing the world, but a lot of it was learned from books, from teachers, from mentors, from other people who spoke into my life. I learned about those things from them, and even simple things like that there are places in other countries called Sydney. That fact is something that I didn't learn for myself. I never went out there. I've never been to Australia, but I still believe that that's so, and I believe I know that it's so. But how do I know that unless I'm relying on somebody else's testimony? So if intellectual autonomy is a virtue in the Aristotelian sense, then you've got those two extremes, remember. You can think for yourself too little in this case, and you can think for yourself too much. And so intellectual autonomy, which is found in the middle, is that mean between those two extremes. And so as I ask in the end here, should we just rely on ourselves for acquiring knowledge? And I think the answer to that is no. We need to some extent, trust other people. We need to learn how to rely on others, but we also need to be able to test which sources of information, which authorities are reliable, and then trust those. When is it appropriate to trust what other people tell us? And so those are the questions that I leave you with. The point I'm trying to make is that it is generally the case that we do rely on others, and this is how it should be, right? Well, that at least gives you something to think about, and I hope you found this handout helpful.